Hello, dear listener. My name is Rose, and I am the writer, director, etc., general chaos mongerer of this podcast audio drama adaptation novel. Too many keywords. Anyway, I would like to welcome you to our 5th season of the Wessex drama, with an adaptation of Thomas Hardy's novel, The Trumpet Major. As with our last few, this is, of course, a romance story with some light-hearted bits. Anne has to choose from 3 suitors of varying levels of suitableness, all while King George and his entire court comes to their small town of Weymouth to survey the possible invasion of Napoleon. I wish to clarify here, this is not that they are invading Napoleon, it's that Napoleon may possibly invade us. Politics. So pop on your mob cap, loosen your stays, and vaguely curse at the French, because, hey, I mean, they're French. And let's sit down to watch the unfortunate attempts of young romance to blossom.
Overcombe Back Lane, day. Anne, dressed for walking out, comes around the corner of the Mill's garden hedge to enter the gate to the field containing the track to Oxwell Hall, when, to her disgust, she sees Festus lurking there. Anne sets her face and hurries past without looking at him.
Heyday, Mistress Annie. Why are you not going the usual way to my uncle's?
I was thinking of going round by the road.
Why?
Because of the wet grass.
Isn't any.
I have my reasons.
It's nothing to do with me.
Festus shrugs and walks away. Anne, seeing him walk away down the lane, then goes into the field by the gate. 1 minute later, Festus suddenly appears by her side. Anne is infuriated.
I don't wish for your company, sir. I don't allow it.
Festus shrugs sardonically.
Allow it or not, I'm coming.
Then, I suppose, as you are stronger than I must submit to your bullying. You're not a gentleman, though.
Oh, I'm just a common yeoman, I am. I don't have a rich family or a swaggering costume of a hussar. I thought that your go away meant come on, as it does with so many other women.
He stands still, makes a deep, ironic bow, and lets her go on alone. Anne hurries away. Oxwell Hall, parlour, day. Anne is reading to Squire Derriman when Festus comes into the parlour. His uncle asks him what he wants, but Festus just shrugs, plonks into an armchair and stares intently at Anne. Derriman frowns and asks the infuriated Anne to continue and, eventually, with reluctance and half turning her head away, she continues with reading out from the paper. Eventually, Festus gets up and lounges slowly outside. Anne and Uncle Benjamin both heave sighs of relief, and Uncle Benji fans himself with some old papers. Anne eventually rises to go, and Derriman signs to her to take the paper. She smiles and nods her thanks. Anne looks apprehensively at the doorway through which Festus recently went. Anne curtsies to Derriman, who smiles and bows slightly back from his armchair. Anne leaves the parlour. Oxwell Haffont door, day. Anne comes out into the front courtyard and sees no one. She suddenly bolts across the yard in a different route. Anne then suddenly ducks down and squeezes underneath the hedge. Anne cuts across a small ruined garden and enters upon the old main approach to the hall. She hurries apprehensively away down the main drive. Overcombe area, day. Anne turns into another track and then stomps along this for a distance. She comes to a gate and enters onto a small track across a field. Anne sees the great encampment in the valley below, sighs, and with resignation, and starts off on her footpath around this encampment. The day is hot, and Anne is tired, and still carrying her newspaper, she fans herself with it. Track approaching the mill. Day. As Anne descends to the levels, she sees John Loveday descending from the encampment and stand waiting around the stile where she usually returns from Oxwell Hall. Anne sighs and ducks around a side path, which brings her into the side door of the mill without her having to encounter John. Mrs. Garland's home, sitting room, day. Anne comes in the door carrying the paper which she hands to her mother.
Hello, Mother.
Anne kisses her.
Child, where have you been? You were an age.
I was trying to avoid someone, and so came the long way round.
Mrs. Garland glances out the window and sees John standing by the stile.
Perhaps it's for the best. I have heard of your other affair and think it a wise choice. You have my best wishes in it.
Anne looks astonished.
Other affair? What's that?
You and Festus, my dear. Granny Seymour called and told me on Saturday. That's why I sent you back to Oxwell Hall so early.
Anne sighs in irritation.
Mother, I don't like this at all.
Anne's friend's house, hallway, evening. It is dusk when there is a rap at the door and two young women and Anne go to answer it. They find John Loveday there and he bows and respectfully and removes his shako.
Excuse me, but could I have a word with Miss Anne Garland, please?
The two young women titter, push Anne forward and retire.
Excuse me, Miss Anne, but your mother was worrying. As she said you'd promised to come home after the christening.
Yes, but it rained when Penny asked me to stay. I thought that Mother would realise. She asked you to come for me?
She was worried.
Anne smiles.
1 minute.
She turns back into the house for her reticule and shawl. Overcome down, tracks, evening. Anne and John are walking along a yard apart.
Mother was much alarmed, perhaps?
The truth is, I only actually heard it from my father, but I thought to relieve her mind.
Anne smiles and they walk along.
I often hear your trumpeters blowing their calls. They do it beautifully, I think.
Pretty fair. They might do it better.
If you're the trumpet major, then you taught them how to do it then.
Yes, but I don't know that I should have joined the army, as my father gave me a reasonable education, and your father taught me to draw.
They turn in through another gate and onto another track.
What? Did you know my father?
Ah, yes, many a time I stood by your poor father, while he worked. We're near Oxwell Hall now, I think.
Suddenly, in the dark, they hear a chorus of exclamation inside a near building.
What was that?
I don't know, but I'll go and see.
Don't leave me here. I'm coming with you.
They go off around a nearby agricultural building. Oxwell Hall, evening. John is peering into an ancient dining hall when Anne comes up behind him.
What is the noise about?
There's company in the house.
Company? Farmer Derryman is not at home. Festus persuaded him to take a holiday.
Ah, I suppose this is why.
Anne moves past John and peers in the window herself. There are a dozen yeomanry and Festus around a big table, drinking, singing songs, and hanging drunkenly around each other's shoulders.
Derryman seems reasonably sober.
What's that to me?
Anne marches away towards a tree in the remains of the ruined garden, and John follows her. Oxwell Hall, garden, evening. Suddenly, they hear conversation in the lane beyond the gate. Anne draws in behind the tree and peers out into the half-lit lane.
Mr. Loveday, let us wait here a minute, until they have gone.
She peers out some more.
Oh, 'tis old Mr. Derryman come home. He has hired the old bathing machine horse, and the owner is walking with him.
Uncle Benji dismounts, has a quick squabble with the price of the horse, and then reluctantly pays the man. The man snatches the moiety with aspiration, regards its smallness with disgust, mounts the horse, and canters away. Uncle Benji walks briskly towards the gate, opens it, and enters the garden. When he sees Anne and John, his gait immediately reverts to his normal, bandy-legged totter.
And how was Budmouth, Farmer Derryman? Why have you torn yourself away from King George's Esplanade so soon?
Uncle Benji, Anne and John curtsy and bow to one another.
Ah, Mistress Anne and Mr. Loveday, faith, I couldn't bide such a ruinous place. 'Tis a shilling for this, and half a crown for that. Nothing without paying. King George have ruined the town for other folks.
There is a shout from within the hall.
Hey, what's that?
Your nephew is here, and has company.
My nephew? Here?
He grasps Loveday's arm.
Good folks, will you just step up to the house with me for a second? He.
He totters towards the hall, dragging John with him, followed by Anne. Oxwell Hall, dining hall window, night. There is loud singing going on whilst Derryman peers in at his own dining hall, and then turns back to address John, shaking his fists.
'Tis my best silver tankards they've got. Oh, 'tis my strong beer. 'Tis 8 of my great candles, guttering away when I've only used small uns for the whole of the last year.
You didn't know he was here, then?
No, dash my wig. Will you wait behind that great tree? Again, whilst I get back into me old home, prithee, for a poor old man.
Well, I can stay here for another half hour, sir. After that, though, I must get back to camp.
Anne and John retire to the garden again, and Derryman goes up to his house front. Oxwell Hall, under dining room window, night. Derryman peers in at the rebels, again stands back a little, and then lets rip a squalling at the top of his lungs.
Man are lost! Man are lost! Help! Help! Man are lost! Man are lost! Help! Help!
He pauses a moment and listens. The singing has stopped, and there is a noise of chairs being thrown back and running. Uncle Benji runs behind the corner of the house, just before the yeomanry come tumbling out, pulling on their jackets or unfastening their scabbards and trying to tug their swords out.
'Tis our duty to help folk in distress.
Where are they?
There are sundry drunken calls for lights so that the yeoman can see. Uncle Benji smartly nips back into his own home and locks the door with the bolt. The revellers, however, see John and Anne in a patch of moonlight, and they draw nigh.
'Tis my life, 'tis she. I will not part from you till you're safe at home, my dear.
Your escort is not needed, Mr. Derryman, as Miss Garland's care is in my hands.
Shut your eyes. My men will hold you down here and I will escort you home myself.
We will be the rear guard.
Now, go and get your hats, and don't be long.
Oxwell Hall, front door, night. The soldiers reach the front door and find it locked. They all start bellowing and hammering on the door. A top window opens, and Derryman's senior head appears, wearing a nightcap, with a sheet wound around his jacket-clad shoulders.
What's in ye to roust on his folk at night?
Hang it, it's Uncle Benji. Let us in, Nunk.
Oh, no, you're not. My dear boy is miles away, sleeping in quarters at this time of
Upon
night.
my soul, 'tis I, Uncle Benji.
Let's smash the shutters in.
That's it, we can't. He has fits and the shock of entry might bring them on. If he dies, we're in the clink for manslaughter.
So we can't get our hats to escort Miss Garland home then? She's left. She's run off.
Then 'tis my enemy has tempered her away with him. If I could find that common scoundrel, I'd...
John comes up behind him, out of the gloom.
Yes.
Festus wheels round and sees John and falters.
I would seize his hand and say, guard her well.
A good speech. And I will too.
Festus turns and addresses his drinking companions.
There's shelter in the barn for the night, boys.
They turn and stagger off. John smiles sardonically to himself and slowly shakes his head in the moonlight. He then returns to the village to check that Anne returns safely. Mrs. Garland's garden, lower portion, day. Anne steps out of the door and walks slowly down the path. She takes a last glance at a blonde curl wrapped in a small paper before returning it to her reticule. She sighs and looks up. Mrs. Garland is returning to the house with an empty washing basket when she meets Anne, clad for a walk out with her shawl and bonnet on.
Where are you off to, child?
Oh, just for a walk, Mother.
No, you really mustn't, with all those soldiers in the streets.
Oh, I don't mind them.
That young Mr. Derryman would escort you, if you wanted.
Please don't mention him, Mother.
Well, you'll just have to walk in the garden then.
She nods firmly and marches in. Anne sighs and starts up the garden. As she gets to near the top of the garden, there is a gap in the hedge, and she can see John picking raspberries sideways onto her. He straightens up, sees her, and smiles. They chat together. Mrs. Garland's garden, upper portion, day. Montage. Anne is standing chatting over the hedge on another day with John. Anne is sitting with a book on her lap, talking over the hedge with John. Mrs. Garland is attending to laundry in the lower half of the garden, and she sees Anne laughing over the hedge at John, who is miming playing the trumpet at speed while squinting. Mrs. Garland's house, front garden. Mr. Loveday, the miller, sees the widow as she comes out of her front door to go to the market, and he hails her. She goes over to talk, and he presents her with a spray of flowers, which she smilingly takes and affixes as a corsage. They look at the latest lot of military horses coming to be watered that day. Mrs. Garland is picking blackberries with a small bowl from the front hedge. The miller calls to her and hands her a much bigger bowl over their garden fence. She smiles and says thank you. Mrs. Garland is talking with the miller, who pats her consolingly on the shoulder as she smiles and nods shyly. Overcombe Lane, near the mill, day. Mrs. Garland, Miller Loveday, John and Anne have just vacated Mrs. Garland's front garden, and Mrs. Garland is fastening the gate as she steps out to join the party in the lane. Mrs. Garland and Anne are wearing smart day dress, as is the miller. John is, of course, in uniform. The party walks off down the road towards the gate in the distance, which allows access to the encampment further up on the downs.
I'm sure that we are very grateful to you, Trumpet Major, for taking us around the camp. We've all been most curious to see it.
As have I.
Well, it's nothing special, but we make shift.
He turns to Anne.
Have a care, Miss Anne, in your fine dress and shoes, with the horses' messes, as there's quite a deal of it, of course, with them being quartered up so close.
Mrs. Garland turns to John.
Oh, I think that you can dispense with the miss now, as you are our immediate neighbour, John, and you and Anne have grown up together almost.
John smiles.
Thank you, Miss Garland.
They have arrived at the gate of the encampment, which is guarded by 2 soldiers. John nods to the soldiers and then opens the gate for the party.
That was an episode of The Trumpet Major, written by Thomas Hardy and adapted by me, Rose, and my co-writer, Anne-Marie Goldthorpe. I would also like to thank our new editor on board for this episode, Christopher Mulia. I would also like to thank our amazing cast, Mark Lucas, Oliver Hickey, Stephen Marshall, Izzy Lucas, Mike Stadden, Caro Joy, Dan Armand, Neil Hiley, John Simpson, John Seal, Peter Allison, Alban O'Brien, and Peter Melstock. You can find us on YouTube under Rose Goldthorpe Films. We are also on Spotify, Google, and Apple Podcasts. We might theoretically be on the Thomas Hardy Society website, but as we all know, I'm not exactly good at, being certain of things, so maybe. We are most definitely on the Wessex Dramas website, but we were when I checked last time, which is our own website. If you want more updates on what's happening about these podcasts and our film projects, etc., search up Rose Goldthorpe Films on Instagram or Facebook and sign up for our newsletter. Again, that's probably via our website. It's the best gig there. Thank you again so much for your hard work, support, and kindness, and see you next time.